It's a great privilege to be with you today, and I want to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for all its great work, but especially for holding this event to commemorate a speech so important to the legacy of Ronald Reagan and to the cause of human freedom he so skillfully and valiantly championed. What insight I can offer into President Reagan's Evil Empire address comes from an incident that occurred during my very first meeting with him about a speech draft in the early weeks of his presidency. The upcoming address was to the Conservative Political Action Conference. After President Reagan made a decision about something to be included in the speech, I was getting up to leave when I suddenly realized that rather than ending the meeting, President Reagan was still talking. In fact, he was talking to me and apologizing profusely, saying how sorry he was, how very, very sorry. I was surprised, but when I realized the reason for President Reagan's apology, I was even more taken aback. It had to do with a section of the draft that mentioned someone who, in leaving communism for the cause of freedom, had become a great hero of the conservative political movement. His name was Whittaker Chambers, a man I knew President Reagan had much admired for coming forward in the late 1940s to expose Soviet espionage in the U.S. government. He had also seen in Chambers' description of communist tactics similarities to his own struggle against the Stalinists who'd been trying to take over the Hollywood unions. Knowing, too, of President Reagan's admiration for Witness, Chambers' famous and magisterial autobiography, I had put in the CPAC draft a story from his memoir about his career as a Time magazine editor after he had broken with the Communist Party, describing a conversation he had with a young woman staff member who had come to him for advice. Chambers explained that, like so many other young intellectuals and writers of the time, she was pro-communist, pro-Stalin. Her concern was over her father, a German diplomat who had recently visited Moscow and had become, to her grave disappointment, anti-Soviet. She loved her father, Chambers wrote, and the irrationality of his defection embarrassed her. He was immensely pro-Soviet, she said, and then you will laugh at me, but you must not laugh at my father. And then one night in Moscow, he heard screams. That's all. Simply one night he heard screams. Chambers wrote about the young staff member. With 5 annihilating words, one night he heard screams. She had destroyed communism as the myth of the 20th century. His next paragraph followed. What communist has not heard those screams? They come from husbands torn forever from their wives in midnight arrests. They come muffled from the execution cellars of the secret police, from the torture chambers of the Lubyanka, from all the citadels of terror, now stretching from Berlin to Canton. They come from those freight cars loaded with men, women, and children, the enemies of the communist state, locked in, packed in, left on remote sidings to freeze to death at night in the Russian winter. They come from minds driven mad by the horrors of mass starvation, ordered and enforced as a policy of the communist state. They come from the starved skeletons, worked to death or flogged to death as an example to others in the freezing filth of subarctic labor camps. They come from children whose parents are suddenly, inexplicably taken away from them, parents they will never see again. A powerful passage, and during our meeting, I realized it was not only the source of President Reagan's apology, but why I was the only one in the room he was apologizing to, whose forgiveness he was asking. Because Reagan knew I was the only one to know or remember what had happened to the Chambers quote when Reagan had worked on the CPAC draft and then sent it back to speechwriting. It was gone. Reagan had exited out. And while on seeing this I had regretted it, I knew instantly why he had done it, that in a sense he had no choice. Only a short time earlier, he had caused consternation in Washington when at his first news conference, he had pointed out the Soviets' ideology permits them to lie and steal and cheat in negotiations. This truth-telling about the Soviets had created a DC media environment that right then could not possibly have handled the anti-communist Chambers quote. So while I had regretted seeing the excision, my regret had not lasted long, since I knew Reagan was just being prudent, presidentially prudent. But though I hadn't thought much about Reagan's cut, after seeing it, clearly Reagan had, because he was about to do something else I would remember forever. First, he said how much he believed everything in that quote, but then he added, "The timing just isn't right, just isn't right." And as he did so, he let his shoulders sag, and he got a look I can't forget, one that stays with me forever, a look that showed not just disappointment, nor disheartedness, but desolation. Reagan was desolate. And then in a voice that had all the sadness in the world in it, he said, "Sometimes presidents can't say everything they want to." I should have said something to him to make him feel better because, as someone who had grown up in the conservative political movement, I knew why he had wanted so badly to state publicly that Chambers quotation. Because it solved the problem that had so long troubled Reagan and other conservative leaders, as over the decades they had tried to warn America of the communist menace. And that was the numbers problem. The problem of how to make real the communist capacity for carnage, its record of killing on such a sweeping scale it made exactitude impossible, with the Soviet Union exterminating maybe 20 or 30 or 40 million, Mao's China 50, 60 million, and smaller communist regimes like Vietnam offing 1 or 2 million more of its people, while Cambodia killed 1/10 of its population. So the numbers problems. So aptly stated by that old charmer Stalin himself when he said a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths just a statistic. That was why Reagan wanted to keep what communist has not heard those screams, that whole passage. Because somehow such was the power of that quotation, all the broken, shattered lives of the otherwise forgotten victims of communism, the tens and tens and tens of millions, in the force and power of Whittaker Chambers' eloquent anguish. For a moment they have faces. For a moment they have voices. For a moment each of them is remembered and is real. Something else happened then that I need to tell you about. The change in the desolate Reagan of a few moments ago. Sitting up and smiling, he looked first at others in the room and then back at me. He asked, "Say, speaking of Whittaker Chambers, do any of you fellows know when he first began to doubt his faith in communism?" My chance to impress my boss and display my mastery of the Chambers work. So you can imagine what was going through my mind, and what was going through my mind was nothing, nada. I had no idea what Reagan was talking about. Seeing my perplexity, as well as that of the others, Reagan took a moment and then began. Well, one morning at breakfast with his little daughter. Redemption. I felt redemption. I pointed to my ear. Reagan stopped, smiled, and nodded with approval. Then he went on to describe for the others how Chambers, in watching his daughter at breakfast one morning, had suddenly found himself struck by her tiny ear, its outer and inner complexity, its intricacy. His next thought had been that what he was seeing could not be just a wholly materialistic or quantitative event. It could not be, as communist doctrine held, a chance coming together of atoms in nature. Suddenly, then, Chambers had doubts, Reagan said, doubts about the faith to which he had dedicated his life, and for which he had betrayed his country. In merely gazing in wonder, as fathers have over the millennia at their tiny daughters, Chambers had the encounter that no materialist or communist, no atheist or agnostic can guard against too carefully. An encounter with the observable, the empirical, yes, the material and quantitative, that leads irresistibly to the recognition of symmetry and beauty, and the detection of design, and all the other signals of transcendence. Reagan explained how this opened Chambers' eyes to the nature of reality, and yes, even the possibility of God. And it is here I wish there was time to tell you in detail about how, when he finished his story, Reagan somehow got a glow and a luminescence. Another look I will never forget. Reagan sat there, and he glowed, and he had his luminous moment over Chambers' luminous moment. So much so that by the time I had left that meeting, I was saying to those around me, we won. The Cold War is over. Freedom just won. The next night at CPAC, Reagan would use another quote from Chambers to explain. That's why the Marxist vision of man without God must eventually be seen as an empty and a false faith, the second oldest in the world, first proclaimed in the Garden of Eden with the whispered words of temptation, "Ye shall be as gods." The crisis of the Western world, Whittaker Chambers reminded us, exists to the degree in which it is indifferent to God. The Western world does not know it, he said, about our struggle, but it already possesses the answer to this problem, but only provided that its faith in God and the freedom he enjoins is as great as communism's faith in man. This is the real task before us, to reassert our commitment as a nation to a law higher than our own, to renew our spiritual strength. Well, I think you can see by now that the events of that very first speech meeting gives vital context for the address that is the subject of today's commemoration. Ronald Reagan had shown he knew the real way to victory in the Cold War or other earthly struggles. For him, the real source of power in the world didn't reside with who has the largest GNP or the biggest battalions. The real source of power in a chaotic, calamitous world was those mysterious but beneficent forces that ultimately have a positive and dispositive effect on the course of human events, as long as their power is sought and asked for, and then tapped into. He liked the Westerns, Reagan once said about that movie genre, because they show that in the good versus evil struggle going on in the world, good holds the ultimate advantage. Reagan believed that, and he believed especially in the power of the truth, the ontological power of the truth. So Reagan demonstrated how right the philosopher was in answering the question of how we know the transcendentals actually exist, how we know goodness, truth, and beauty are real. Look at their power in the world. No evil empire story better illustrates that truth than the one that comes from inside the Gulag, from Natan Sharansky, himself a great hero of the struggle for human freedom. When he and others in their prison heard through Pravda's denunciation that Reagan actually had said evil empire, such was their excitement they were willing to risk any form of punishment, including solitary confinement, so that all the prisoners would know. If a president of the United States had actually used such a term, it meant Soviet communism was doomed. Help in understanding why simple words could so weaken the Soviet state and its rulers comes from another great hero for freedom, the late Viktor Bukovsky. He reminded us that such words from outsiders give hope and inspiration to those whom criminal regimes always fear the most, their own oppressed people. For free nations, then, in dealing with criminal regimes, there is, beyond economic sanction or military force, a third option, the most powerful option of all, telling the truth about such regimes, being candid about their moral squalor and, yes, their evil, but also pointing to their denial of reality, their attempt to make themselves as God, the fact that they are ontological and existential absurdities. That is why when others speak to dictators' worst fear, their lack of moral legitimacy, it triggers in them a catastrophic anxiety, and ultimately a loss of will in the implosion of empire. For all the power that comes from their capacity for terror and murder, their willingness to cause screams in the Moscow night, they must also hide this inner fear and their own self-knowledge that ultimately their hold on power is fragile and the course of their rule inevitably destructive. Both intuitively and quite consciously, Reagan knew all this, and that's why, believe me, I know, Reagan's Evil Empire speech was all about Reagan. Because while over the years my name has been associated with the draft, I am quite proud that right from the first I was telling people just look at the archives. You'll see this was not any speechwriter's text. It was Ronald Reagan's. Look at his work on the draft as he throws out the whole first half and he writes his own. Then in the foreign policy section, he strengthens the part morally confronting the Soviets, but also the part emphasizing the West's duty to offer the hand of conciliation, not as a ploy or tactic as the Soviets would, but because we are enjoined, as Reagan would write, to help others through our prayers to find truth and a redemptive road. That is also the reason Reagan's Evil Empire speech must never be seen as a one-time event, but part of a continuum in which he systematically pursued his paradoxical course of confrontation and conciliation, candor and diplomacy. In knowing that criminals or criminal regimes are different from normal people or governments, Ronald Reagan understood they always take offers of conciliation as signs of weakness, or even a provocation to do something worse, unless first they are morally confronted and their illusions removed. And so the Reagan continuum was always there. Just after that first news conference, Reagan's West Wing pragmatist aides set up an interview where he could do a walkback on his truth-telling about Soviet ideology. From their standpoint, he only made it worse by going theological and telling the media how communism was opposed to the good things, like God in the afterlife. In those first weeks of his presidency, he talked at a British embassy dinner toast about communism as passing, a sad, bizarre chapter in human history. And he talked, too, of the need to plan for a post-Soviet world. 2 months later, at a Notre Dame commencement, in another speech that Reagan redid himself, he developed his doom of communism theme in more detail. You can see it on YouTube. It's called Source of All Strength. And remember, Reagan was saying all this at a moment when the Soviet Union was at the height of its power and expansion, and at a time Western elites and the intelligentsia were mobilized by their own pessimism, not to mention their distress and despair over Ronald Reagan and his ideas. Then, of course, came Reagan's first major speech abroad at Westminster Hall to members of the British Parliament. What can I say except I remember Richard Pipes of the NSC calling me to his office and how we sat first giggling and then laughing nearly uncontrollably as we read to each other the secret cables recording Moscow's hysteria that Reagan would turn back on the Soviets, their own phrase, the ash heap of history, and say the Cold War was at the turning point. And by the way, the British Labour Party statement about the speech was nearly as deranged as the Soviets. A short time later, Reagan was the first U.S. president to do a captive nations event, and in the Rose Garden, no less. In a 1964 Dublin speech, hailed by the media as a great peace initiative from a new and no longer anti-communist Reagan, he actually angered the Soviets with the extent of his anti-communist critique, and quotes from the likes of Lech Walesa. So conciliation, but always confrontation too. And yes, after the failure of the Soviets' desperate attempt to defeat Reagan for re-election, they finally decided to try new and a more soft-line approach, anything to stop the truth-telling. But even as Reagan engaged with the new Soviet leadership, the spirit and argumentation of the evil empire address went on. In fact, few greater falsehoods exist than that Reagan tempered his anti-communism. In some ways, it became more systematic and broader. Look at his White House remarks the day before leaving for his third summit with Gorbachev at Reykjavik. Hard to find a more hardline speech. And of course, you are looking at the person who said, "Mr. President, it's early and any number of weeks away from the Berlin speech, but we were just wondering if you had any thoughts about what you would say there." And Ronald Reagan did his imitation of Rich Little, doing Ronald Reagan, and raising his arm said, "Well, yes, tear down the wall." So many told him not to say that, but he said it. And how I remember in that final year, before the Moscow summit, a late-night phone call from National Security Advisor Colin Powell. He was just back from Moscow. "Tony, baby," Colin was from the Bronx. "Tony, baby, 43 minutes, 43 minutes." He had timed Gorbachev as he had hit the desk and ranted at him and Secretary of State George Shultz about Reagan's recent speeches. That same night, I also heard about an early draft of a Washington Post story blaming me for letting the speechwriting department jeopardize the upcoming Moscow summit. Kind of proud of that, actually, and even a bit sorry it didn't make it past the Post editors. Finally, on the day of his last summit with Gorbachev at Liberty Island, Reagan made a point of saying in a speech, "I am still an anti-communist." We could go on, but the record is there on what Reagan did to upset the Soviets. Come to think of it, there's also quite a record of how Reagan's candor upended his political critics and opponents. I just wish there was time for that because some of it is fun. Well, maybe there's time for just a little fun. By noting how the House Democrats, led by Congressman Edward Markey, had it all arranged, they would position Reagan as a warmonger by having a House committee endorse the nuclear freeze and the media follow up with extensive coverage. A freeze, by the way, that would have handed the Soviets the nuclear blackmail card in Europe and a definitive Cold War victory. The problem for them the next day was that right next to their story on the front page was an account of the Evil Empire speech and its words about the folly of the freeze and the moral occlusion behind it, the attempt by some people to remove themselves from the great moral struggle of the age. Reagan's candor became an unplanned, but quite effective riposte to the Democrats as well, incidentally, to a mischievous cleric who had talked the Catholic bishops into endorsing the freeze. And then there was poor Walter Mondale, who in preparing for his 1984 debate went round and round with his advisors until finally they just gave up. It was too risky to criticize Reagan for the evil empire term. Let's not forget New York Times liberal columnist Anthony Lewis, who, as part of a full meltdown, also committed a grave journalistic transgression. trying to portray Reagan's speech as a simple-minded, jingoistic assertion of American self-righteousness, he did not do his readers the courtesy of telling them Reagan had warned against just such moral pride or self-righteousness, and quite specifically mentioned, yes, America's legacy of evil. And then in his text talked about racism and anti-Semitism, though he did add that in a democracy, we get to admit our mistakes and work to correct them. And I remember, too, seeing my old college paper editor, Strobe Talbot, in a Moscow hotel lobby 4 years after he had predicted in Time magazine that Reagan had permanently alienated the Soviets and made impossible serious negotiations. We exchanged thoughts about the final signing of all those historic treaties Reagan had just negotiated. I didn't gloat. Well, not a lot. You know, his critics never really let go, even after all those arms reduction treaties. Foreign policy grande George Bull criticized Reagan for never giving up his Cold War views and really engaging with the Soviets. And Arthur Schlesinger organized groups of historians to rate Reagan as one of the least effective presidents. Then, of course, there was the editor of Bartlett's Quotations, who insisted for years and years that Reagan didn't really deserve more than one entry. Another group upset by Reagan's candor is also worth noting, my bosses, the West Wing pragmatists, though here I need to be very careful lest I be tempted beyond my strength. As many of you know, on tax cuts and defense increases and stopping his candor about the Soviet Union, they were working hard with the media and the Democrats to get Reagan's decisions overturned. Incidentally, they were also working hard on moving the conservatives out of the speechwriting department and had even wanted me to do the first firings. Well, no speech upset them more than the Evil Empire draft, which they tried through someone they had temporarily given administrative control of speechwriting to get the good parts crossed out. This one time, though, I sort of refused to budge and said, let's just let the president decide. It worked, however close I came to finding my office furniture out in the hallway the next morning. And how I do remember a few months after the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner, Dave Gergen walking around the White House mess saying, as if in a trance, "Evil Empire, evil empire." Far more than his pragmatist aides, Ronald Reagan was ahead of the story, ahead of his times. In one of his books, by the way, Dave Gergen apologized to me, for which I was grateful. A little late, though. You know, the pragmatists always thought, too, that I had some secret channel to Reagan. When NSC advisor Bill Clark finally got my draft for the Westminster speech to Reagan after they had blocked it from going in, they were surprised that he had chosen it over all the other drafts they had rushed in to confuse the situation. Well, they didn't understand my secret channel to Reagan was Reagan's old speeches. My draft simply contained points Reagan had been making, yes, for decades, in his speeches and TV appearances. So as I mentioned, I had grown up in the same anti-communist conservative movement that had formed Reagan, even as he had helped form it. I've been reading his speeches and following his interviews since I was 12, which brings us to our last Evil Empire speech story. You know, the researchers were in a bit of a panic when they called. Reagan had written in a passage having to do with an entertainer who talked once about how he didn't want his children to grow up under communism. They had no idea who he was talking about and didn't know how to check it because it was so long ago. It was Pat Boone, I responded, but they said there's no transcript and no way of getting one to check. Don't worry, the president has it right, I said. That's what Pat Boone said. How would I know? I was there, I said. They came back later and said, this was 1961 or 1962, you were in grade school. I told them, yes, I was an 8th grader at Fred Schwartz's Christian Anti-Communist Crusade rally in Madison Square Garden, where Pat Boone repeated what he had said alongside Reagan at another Schwartz event earlier that year in Southern California. So my secret channel to Reagan then was that wonderful coming together of ordinary Americans, starting in the late 40s and through the 50s with groups like Fred Schwartz's or the Citizens Anti-Communist Committee of Connecticut under its leader, Ed McCallum, which I had joined. Eventually it developed into the Goldwater campaign and then led, of course, to Ronald Reagan's political emergence. It led to other events, too, like Lee Edwards' rally for defeating communism in Vietnam. I was there, too, by the way, as a college student and Lee's entertainer as the right-wing folk singer. Unpaid. Still waiting for that check in the mail, Lee. So you can imagine what it was like not too many years later as I found myself walking into a hotel room in Moscow, and there on the TV, CNN had recently been installed for Western business people, was Ronald Reagan giving the Evil Empire speech. A day later, as a former school kid, remember, who used to go with Hungarians and Cubans and Poles and Czechs from Bridgeport, Connecticut neighborhoods to anti-communist rallies, I understood more fully Balzac's statement that the only justification for the impossible in history is the fact that it had occurred. Because there I was at the Bolshoi Ballet, just a few boxes down from the President of the United States, with my host, the Soviet Union's head of state. I would find out later at one of their bilateral meetings, by the way, Reagan had actually tried out on Gorbachev a version of the Chambers story about the cosmological argument for transcendence in the existence of God. Yes, Ronald Reagan and the Americans of his time, with their robust and healthy bourgeois morality and optimism, they had made all the difference in the course of history and in the struggle for freedom. What they had in common was a belief in transcendence and an understanding of the secret of the ages, that only by acknowledging and accepting the limits to human thought and action can they be exceeded. We must always remember and honor all the countless heroes from Eastern Europe, from Russia and China and Asia in the struggle against communism. But I have always hoped that the people of those nations knew that over the decades millions of unnamed Americans cared deeply about them and also struggled mightily for their freedom as well as our own. The struggle against totalitarianism was the great moral crisis of the 20th century, the bloodiest century of all. A struggle from which the Western elites were absent. A century betrayed by the intelligentsia, but redeemed by the bourgeois. That struggle continues. Yet I don't think there can be any real doubt about its eventual outcome or the role of our country. Ronald Reagan used to talk about the land between the two great oceans as having a special role as the progenitor and protector of representative government. Government answerable to the people and not the other way around. He believed in this nation as the home and a fount of human freedom. Remember this also. In that letter he wrote to the nation when he was taken ill, he said that whatever might be his fate in the years ahead, he knew for certain that for America, a bright dawn always lay ahead. About that, as so much else, I'm quite certain he was right, that once again, Ronald Reagan was telling the truth.